Picking the right gun oil isn't just about cleaning, lubrication, penetration, and preservation. It must be safe. For metal and wood, yes, but also leather, rubber, and your own skin. It should never cake up over time, leaving you both protected and always ready. The right gun oil does all of these things and more. It takes a chore and turns it into a pleasure. Ballistol and Primer, preserving history together.
Hello class, I'm your Professor Gruffudd, and today we'll be learning about the Japanese Empire's Type 14 semi-automatic pistol, popularly known as the Nanbu. We'll have to put an asterisk on that by the end of this class though. The Type 14 is a modernization of sorts of Japan's previous commercial semi-automatic handgun, though some were bought by the Japanese Navy. In other words, this is replacing a revolver. Its overall length is 9.1 inches, that's 23 centimeters. That's fairly long. Weight can be averaged up to 2 pounds or 0.9 kilograms, again, much larger than you might think. And that's very surprising when we consider that we have a single stack 8-round detachable box magazine that only takes the 8x22mm diminutive Nambu cartridge. So, a little odd. Quick announcement before we get started. For those of you who are actual students and not just auditors of the subject, your study guide for the last lesson has already been sent out. That, of course, was the one on the 1911 A1 pistol. If you'd like to join the class and receive a guide for every lesson, join us on Patreon or Subscribestar. For our topic today, we'll only have to really do a little bit of a brief review. We've spoken before about the rapid modernization of the Japanese Empire by the turn of the century. Well, back in 1893, they had adopted a centerfire 9mm revolver, double action only, top rake. This used a rebounding Fanyu style of lockwork, and it's a pistol we've covered in some detail before. Frankly, it's an impressively handy and fairly modern revolver for its era. Unfortunately, it was paired with a cartridge that lacked for much lethality. The underpowered 9mm is probably best compared to the still popular 9mm Browning Short, otherwise known as .380 ACP. Just at a glance, you can tell this revolver cartridge wouldn't even ruin a blowback pistol. The Type 26 revolver had mostly fallen out of favor due to engagements in mainland China, specifically on the Liaodong Peninsula, better known as the Kwantung Leased Territory. This region was placed under Japanese control by the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki following the First Sino-Japanese War. It was briefly lost to Russia before being returned at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. The Kanto-gun, or Kwantung Army, was formed in 1906 to secure the Kwantung Leased Territory and South Manchurian Railway Zone. Over time, the Kanto-gun took on its own fairly independent ambitions, often ignoring the orders from back home. At the same time, various armed action in the region, albeit mostly minor for a time, revealed issues with the Type 26, most notably that its weak cartridge didn't always penetrate the heavy jackets of the native bandits and warlord troops. Now, this might seem like a lot to explain the low power, but I also just wanted you to all be aware of Japan's general thrust and ambition during this period of development, especially the kind of opposition they expected to face. Weapons designer Kijiro Nanbu would take on the Type 26 revolver by designing his own limited series of semi-automatic pistols. These were provided in 2 sizes, large and small, and 2 cartridges, 8mm and 7mm. Over time, the larger pattern was refined, resulting in its final commercial form. Now, in English, we tend to call these by a set of nicknames, the Grandpa, Papa, and Baby Nambus. More recently, it's popular to model date them to 1902. As a matter of fact, that was the standard of knowledge when we produced our lesson on the last of his large semi-automatics. What we called the Model 1902 Modified is probably now better known as the Nanbu Large Type B. Now, I still happen to have one of those here, by the way, so we can take a quick close look. We've seen her before, so I don't want to go into too much crazy detail, but this is what we previously called the 1902 modified, although more correctly might be known as a large type B. We'll get back to you on that as we finish up our reading and writing on this old assignment that's going to be redone. But just as a quick tour, we have a pistol that's weighted heavily to the rear like a Luger with a little sticky of a barrel poking out. We have a curved Luger-like trigger again, and then we have a forward grip safety. Our magazine release is in a very usable position, and we have a box single stack magazine with a big old finger pad for grabbing at the bottom and a fairly heavy base that provides rigid support to the bottom of the magazine. And then, of course, this is a short recoil lock breech pistol that is not slide operated. Instead, we have a charging handle at the rear that's attached to our breech block. We come back, the barrel assembly comes along with us for a brief distance. Our recoil spring is set in the left side of the frame, very awkward and asymmetric. You can even see the extension on the side of the cocking piece to make sure that we get a hold of that. Look at that guy. And we have a full-length guide rod going all the way through that recoil spring up to almost the front of the housing. The sights are a tangent adjustable V. This was a very ambitious pistol because this version was never even fitted for a stock. The earlier one, however, was. All in all, you can see that this is a commercial pistol with a lot of hand contouring, lots of hand fitting and finish on it. This is not something that you're going to manufacture very rapidly. The large Type B underwent a series of trials starting in September of 1907, the end result of which was actually approval for its adoption by the Army as the Type 41. This was being finalized in March of 1910 when Minister of the Army Masatake Terauchi shut the project down. His reason was that given the limited budget and personnel of the Japanese Army, a pistol was hardly the first priority and the old revolver would just have to make do. Ultimately, what would have been the Type 41 was not adopted, though roughly 9,000 were purchased as equipment for the Navy. The pistol matter, therefore, was abandoned until after the end of the First World War. The Japanese Empire's role during the war had been fairly limited, both militarily and economically. In the meantime, however, the Europeans involved had radically evolved their tactics and armaments. Starting in 1919, the Japanese Technical Review Department was renamed to the Army Technical Headquarters and tasked with research and development of basically all new weapons technology. Included in this was, of course, the now even more outdated handgun, which now fell under the heading of a general policy adopted in July of 1920, which described the responsibilities and goals of small arms modification and replacement. Looking towards the future, not only was the Type 26 dropped, but so was the notion of a revolver at all. It had now become apparent that the future was auto-loading, thanks to experiences during the Great War. Only a handful of locked breech auto-loading pistols were a standard issue at the start of the war, and even these were often too few in number and too complex to produce to allow for full issue during the conflict. Every country that fielded the guns you see also fielded revolvers to fill in the gaps. Now, a number of blowback or unlocked breech pistols were also pushed into service due to the war, though Belgium had actually done it on purpose years before. These were almost universally chambered for the .32 ACP cartridge. Small, light, and moving at about 900 feet per second, the .32 wasn't a showstopper. If we lay over the Type 26, you'll see, yeah, it's almost 30% faster, but still half the weight, so not a good replacement. The other emerging blowback cartridge was .380 ACP, which we saw earlier wasn't that far off from the same wimpy revolver cartridge. No, if Japan wanted a military handgun, it was obviously going to be locked breech. Now, we all know that they had a domestic model available already in limited service with the Navy. Unfortunately, this was a fairly complicated handgun and not really fit for mass adoption and therefore mass production, especially as the Army was moving towards as much machine operation and as little hand fitting as possible. So the Army Technical Headquarters designed their own replacement locked breech automatic and commissioned the Tokyo Arsenal to manufacture it. This prototype apparently underwent testing starting in April of 1921. Now, I'd love to show it to you, or at least some sort of drawing, but to my knowledge there are none, just a handful of loose references to various handgun tests at that time. To be honest, there could be more tests or even more pistols, but we can't know this unless some otherwise lost paperwork turns back up in the Japanese archives. The likelihood is a bit remote though, because while these pistols were being developed, disaster struck. The Great Kanto earthquake of September 1923, with its epicenter just 60 kilometers southwest of the capital, Tokyo. This massive quake devastated the region. Striking at the same time as strong winds from a nearby typhoon, fires then ravaged the city. It's estimated that between 105 and 142,000 people died. Over half of Tokyo and almost all of Yokohama were destroyed. The quake also wrecked the Tokyo arsenal, including the test pistols up to that point and almost all associated documentation. What we do know is that this core design of a locked breech automatic made it through several rounds of testing and improvement, including being sent to the infantry, cavalry, and field artillery schools for their inspection. In January of 1923, it was pitted up against several foreign-made pistols, and here we have a fun game because what the Japanese ordnance called various pistols at the time is a bit hard to correspond to known designs that we've seen in our lessons. The first was a Nambu large model pistol. We're pretty confident we know what that was. The second was just listed as Bergman, which I'll guess in context was a model 1910 or maybe the very similar 1912. Regardless, it would have been a 6-round double stack in 9mm Largo, unless I'm missing out on another gun. Next, they list a Rexer large pistol, which I'm pretty sure would have been one of the 11mm Danish Skobo automatics, as these were licensed to Rexer. Which exact version, I have no clue, because to my knowledge, Rexer was liquidated well before the start of the Great War, let alone this period. A Parabellum Small was also listed, which I assume to be the .30 caliber Luger, something along the lines of what was adopted by the Netherlands. Last two I'm struggling with, a small Colt and a similar model from Browning. That could be a lot of things, like say the Colt 1903 Pocket Hammerless and the larger FN 1903 Daguerre model, though both of those are blowback, and basically all of the Browning pistols from FN would have been blowback as well. Then again, that Rexer must have been over a decade out of date at this point, so who knows what's going on with what little we see on this trial. Anyway, all of these went against the native design, and a couple of flaws were noticed. First, the mystery cartridge was too weak, clocking in at just over 300 meters per second, which was frankly closing in on 1,000 feet, so not terrible compared to the Type 26, though bullet weight and diameter are unknown. The second problem was that the coil springs of every variety were not holding up when made at home in Japan. This was frankly a huge problem for the Japanese Empire, as all the way through to the end of World War II, the unique combination of metallurgy and heat treatment required to produce an effective, long-lasting coil spring just wasn't in their hands. Japanese springs took on a set way too fast, losing their spring back force quickly, which is brutal for an automatic. Strangely, I do know of some autoloaders that use flat springs, but none of these are listed in the surviving documents, so perhaps the Japanese army was unaware. Fun side story here, by the way. Before the start of the Second World War, there was a Japanese man who interned as a car mechanic before opening up his own garage, handling various repairs. He often cursed the lack of domestically produced piston rings, as waiting on shipments from overseas was a nightmare. Now, piston ring, of course, is like a kind of spring. It's very important that the metallurgy and heat treatment be just right. He ended up obsessively pursuing a solution to this problem, setting up his own factory and product, and becoming the only supplier of these critical parts just before the Second World War. And that man's name was Soichiro Honda, the only one of the big Japanese auto manufacturers today who wasn't already an industrial scale concern before the war. So springs were very important and in very short supply. So our mystery pistol was apparently underpowered and liked to eat crappy springs. Before any of this could be resolved, the Kanto quake hit, and it ate up a lot of the project documents. Surprisingly, however, something of the project must have survived, as more testing followed in September of 1924, again fielded to the infantry, cavalry, field artillery schools. All but the artillery felt the new pistol was fine. The dissenters said it was too heavy and large. Now, we can't prove this was the same pistol, though it is fairly likely. Again, documentation is lacking, as the arsenal system was in the midst of a radical reorganization, let alone the damage from later US bombings. At this point, it seems that the project was fairly mature by Japanese Army standards at that time. However, a curveball seems to have been pitched back in August of 1924. Then Lieutenant General Takao Suzuki, younger brother of the Prime Minister and classmate of Kijiro Nambu, was appointed Chief of the Army Technical Headquarters. Shortly after his appointment, the up until now prototype pistol seems to have fallen out of the running. One explanation I've seen given is that as the Japanese Army began to consider issue of pistols to their light machine gunners, the matter of being underpowered became more acute. Additionally, the prototype pistol was supposedly too expensive to produce for an even more expanded demand as the handgun was spreading into wider issue. Regardless of whether it was for good reasons or just the implied nepotism, the mystery first prototype was done for, and a new pattern was put forward in September of 1924, one based on the previous Nambu. Designed and produced at Tokyo Arsenal's rifle factory, which to this point had no involvement in the pistol trials, this facility had, however, been involved in producing the commercial Nambu large type pistols. That had served as the basis for that trial's Type 41 before the start of the Great War. It's likely they were making use of existing tooling and knowledge to solve the problem of mass production. I should also point out that at this point the original inventor, Kijiro Nambu, had been promoted to Lieutenant General, had no direct influence on the trials, and as far as I know, no financial incentive towards adoption of this particular pistol. Instead, what we're calling the Nambu Type 14 very commonly in the West was likely the creation of then Captain Tomonori Yoshida. Born January 29, 1891 in Tokyo, he attended Aso Junior High before entering the Army Academy, from which he emerged into the artillery branch, commissioning as a second lieutenant in 1912. In 1915, he was promoted to first lieutenant, and in 1920, captain. In this role, he served on the staff of the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. Yoshida's simplified Nambu, designated as Prototype Mark B, also made use of Nambu's 8mm cartridge, which is something of an odd choice as it wasn't really all that powerful. The commercial cartridge had, on paper as of 1903 and before the original pistols were in mass manufacture, reasonably respectable specifications. It's theorized that it was based off 7.65 Parabellum, that's 30 Luger, which 8mm Nambu does beat out to some little degree. Unfortunately, the actual manufactured ammunition looked like this, just about on top of 7.65 Parabellum. This reduction may have come thanks to the realities of available springs and quality of heat treatment for parts at the time. This ammo will change somewhat, but not until after our pistol is already adopted. If we compare it to 380 ACP, we can see we're not gaining much, and it's somewhat confusing why we bothered with a bottlenecked case or even a locking breech, if this is all the power we're bringing. It appears that the Japanese Army was content to compare the cartridge to the previous revolver's 9mm, at which point it does look a lot better. Testing showed the old revolver could only manage 3 centimeters of penetration on cedar board, while the Nambu managed 16. Frankly, it's fairly likely that the Nambu cartridge making machinery was up for grabs and would represent a huge savings on development, but again, I have no records on that front either. It's just speculation. In November of 1924, 5 Yoshida-style simplified Nambu pistols were submitted to trials. These were tested for projectile velocity, which was found to be an acceptable 317 meters per second. That's a little over 1,000 feet per second. If that sounds bad, I'll point out that the measurement was at least made at 10 meters distance from the muzzle. Accuracy was deemed to be acceptable. However, on day 2, the pistol suffered severely under the endurance testing trials. By the way, each gun was only expected to fire 200 rounds for this test, so 1,000 total across all 5. The endurance test included continuous rapid fire, though with only 200 rounds total. I have no idea what that really means. Dunking the gun in water and then firing it after removal, dropping the magazine in sand, then inserting, charging, and firing, and my favorite, shooting the guns while swinging them from side to side rapidly. I'm really not sure what that was supposed to test for, or if I've just lost something in translation. The 3 pistols which did best were then left overnight without cleaning and fired 74 times the next day. This apparently increased the malfunction rate. The major problems were Misfires from light strikes, failures to return to battery, poor extraction and ejection of cases, and frequent failure to feed, especially the last round in the magazine. These, of course, resulted in jamming and double feeds. You'll note that basically all of these can be explained by poor coil springs, so perhaps the pistols just had one mechanical problem after all. Other notes on the pistols were made though. The grip safety was too large. A manual safety would make a nice feature. The magazine falls free easily when using the pistol in the left hand thanks to bumping that release button. However, if the mag release button is shortened up into the grip panel more, it's impossible to release with thick gloves on. The trigger guard opening is too small for those same gloves, by the way. So a variety of small changes were introduced, the most major of which was deleting the grip safety entirely, so not small at all, and fitting a manual lever. 3 examples of the resulting pistol were then sent to the infantry, cavalry, and field artillery schools for their own testing in late December of 1924. That's 1 pistol for each. Reports came back in February of 1925, and overall they were deemed functionally good, suitable for service with minor modification. Though I suspect the same problems were boiling under the surface because in March of 1925, another round of testing revealed problems with ejection, failure to return to battery, and poor lifting of cartridges. Again, corrections were made, along with modifications to the grip, base of the magazine, extractor, cocking piece, and lanyard ring. What exactly, I can't say. Test firing in April was apparently considered successful. Much of the final form was approved in August, and on November 13th of 1925, the final version of the test pistol was provisionally accepted as the Type 14. That would be the 14th year of the Taisho Imperial era. Just add 1911 for Taisho dates to get a Gregorian output. The resulting pistol was patented under Captain Tomonori Yoshida's name, with approval coming in July of 1927. He transferred the rights as inventor to the Army. Curiously, this date is after production was begun for the Army, but only a few weeks before the Type 14 was officially adopted by the Navy. Yoshida's patent focused on the new transfer bar disconnect and a set of symmetrical nested recoil springs using a sort of receiver bridge as the base for support. That disconnect, by the way, is a bit simpler than the previous and prevents a narrow potential of pulling the trigger just so and getting striker follow. The final pistol is all but identical to the one featured here. Now at this point I should mention that an undated trials pistol has turned up. We can't seem to find any paper trail on its creation, but at least 5 examples have appeared, and the highest serial known is 13. That means it was seriously considered at some point in time, presumably before the adoption of the Type 14. I don't have any photos, but we can make do with this drawing. Apparently produced at the Tokyo Arsenal, its most outstanding feature is a double-stack magazine capable of holding 15 rounds of 8mm Nambu. The Type 14, I remind you, was just 8. Unloaded, it weighed 2.4 pounds, that's 1.1 kilos. It features a more reasonable short-throw manual safety, the open frame and dual recoil springs, among other features, from our new Yoshida model are present, but it still retains a tangent rear sight, side set striker lug, pivoting lanyard loop, and other provisions of the old Nambu. Whether this serves as a missing link or another competitor, I cannot say, but it's worth knowing about until we manage to learn more someday. Anyway, Yoshida's Nambu saw further modification into the start of serial production. While I don't have number 1 right here, I think it's enough, or early enough, to start discussion. So let's take a look at what Japan got. All right, we have our Type 14, and just for a quick comparison's sake, there is our older large Type B. Now, just at a glance, you can see this is a much thinner pistol, many more straight lines. We'll hold this guy to the side so that we can look at individual features, but let's start walking down the list here. The grip is almost excessively long and dead straight, parallel lines, and yeah, it's narrow enough to fit in the hand, but I wouldn't call it a very organic feel. Some people love it, some people can't stand it. It does, however, seem to work. The wood originally would have been Philippine mahogany, and as time went on, cheaper woods were substituted in. This lacquer would have been of urushi. The trigger guard is almost perfectly round with our Luger-like round trigger inside, and the transfer bar system is Luger reminiscent, although it works slightly better than that. It does have a fairly short opening. It's actually even smaller than its precursor. The travel here from the face of the trigger to the front on average is 2 millimeters shorter for the new Type 14, so they really tightened it up, not necessarily expanded it. Now both pistols use the same short recoil locking block that's tilted down in here. We'll see it more in our animation, but if you look up top, you'll see they've done sort of a Beretta job. They've cut away most of this, though not the slide. This is that upper frame assembly in which that barrel extension moves back and forth. On the old pistol, it was fully and probably unnecessarily enshrouded. And boy, you can tell that's got a slacked old spring, can't you? This also allowed you just to have enough room to fit a fixed rear sight, which has a very strange sight picture because it's not undercut. It's actually sort of triangular. The base inside the sights, the base of the relief, is wider than the top. This triangular setup is almost unheard of in firearms history, although we have seen one more recently. But what's stranger still is that our barleycorn front sight isn't even at the same angle. It's actually much narrower, although that's going to be hard for me to represent here. Instead, we'll just use a quick image to show you what I mean. This means that you're basically aligning 3 tips, which is a little awkward. Now the cocking piece is much simplified. It can be cut from round stock and just sort of ground off top and bottom to give it a little bit of flatness. The whole thing's checkered. It has 3 raised ridges so you can really get a good grip on it in all sorts of weather and pull that guy straight on back. Instead of the complicated assembly of the old Nambu, which by the way has his signature rear end on there straight off the Type 38, boy, that looks familiar. Instead of that, again, we're just round. We've got a cantilever in here. And then if you see, I can press on this guy right here and he goes in. What's retaining this from rotating off the pistol, and you can see there's a good bit of play in there, is actually the plunger behind the spring for the firing pin. We can actually press on what is our firing pin spring in order to disassemble this pistol. More on that in a moment. Overall, the transfer bar arrangement at the rear is very similar in how it releases, but of course our firing pin is set up more centrally than it is off to the side here with a sideways wing-a-ding. The mag release is exceedingly simple. It's actually only 1 piece compared to most guns being 2 pieces. It works by depressing it, and the mag of course falls free and even has a little extra oomph from the follower tension at this moment. But it proved to be a little too simple. It actually is prone to releasing under inertial force, which proved to be a big problem for the Japanese army. The magazine is nickel plated, and at the base these would have originally been aluminum, but would later move on to be some sort of lightened alloy. This whole assembly is really blocked out to make sure we get good alignment of the spring that feeds the magazine, which is unfortunately round and therefore requires alignment. There's other better ways to do this, but this is what they went with. Magazines are usually serialized to their pistol, and it's not uncommon to see these serials struck out and remarked to be corrected as they were gathered up from who knows what source, maybe the battlefield, maybe overruns, maybe DQ'd pistols, and then refielded after being correctly marked to the pistol they were last fitted for. Now the magazines do have a little button that is set on the follower, but trying to get all 8 rounds in is very aggressive on the thumb. A lot of people don't realize, but there's actually a little hole in there, and that's for a specific reason. If you take your cleaning rod from your kit and flip it over, there's a bend with a reduced diameter pin at the end. That should fit perfectly into your hole, and then you can pull the whole thing down nice and easy. Haha. Now, like I said, short recoil lock breech, so if I pull on the cocking piece, you'll see the entire assembly move just a little bit. Not much. Look especially up here at the front. Not very far, and then the bolt's free to move on its own. If I go ahead and lock this open and flip this over, ooh, magazine's a bit in the way. You can see the edge of the locking block right there. It's the little bit of silver down in the hole. I believe that this was left in place just to allow anything that built up to fall back out, although I've never had confirmation on that point. It's kind of odd that it's not a sealed system, but you can also imagine if anything gummed up in there and stayed gummed up in there, this whole thing would probably fail catastrophically. And while we're discussing the lock open, it's simply the bolt being held to the rear by an extension at the back of the follower. There is no separate component that holds it open when the magazine drops. So that means if you fire your magazine and it locks open, when you go to reload, it doesn't fall free. You have to really pull on that, and then when you reinsert your new magazine, you have to recock your bolt. The manual safety seems to have been an afterthought, something added towards the end of the trials because it cannot be used without using your other hand. There's really no one-handed way to do this well. In its current position, it's on fire, and it says fire. And if we flip it over all the way, it's on safe, and it says safe. The thing leaves marks on the frame, and it also leaves marks on the grip when you mess up and go the wrong way. It's actually surprising this gun, like many others, doesn't just have a gouge straight on through from either the original owner or some GI, just spinning around like a helicopter. This thing works, and that's about the best I can say for it. And it's kind of unfortunate because the trigger itself is so incredibly light on these pistols, unbelievably light. I feel like it does need a manual safety, just not one in this position with a full 180-degree arc in which you have to get your other hand straight into play in an era in which you're supposed to shoot one-handed with pistols. Now, one thing people love about these pistols are all the fun Japanese markings. So if you have 10 and 4, you get 14, that's your year, and then this, of course, is type or model, the type 14. If we flip her over, we're going to see that we have our serial number, which is preceded by the Nagoya inspection mark in front of the simplified form of Nan from Nanbu. This is a Nambu made Nambu, although I guess it would be Chokogo by this point. If we look down here, we should have a little character that's the first character out of Showa for that era, and then in this case you would add 1925, so you get 1936, and that's the third month of the year. That's when she was made. Now, disassembly of this pistol is very simple, and there's actually even simpler ways with fewer steps than what I'm about to show you. This is a good way to not mess up a collectible. So I like to leave the magazine in and lock the pistol open. All right, with that, we have now taken all the tension off of our firing pin spring and firing pin, at least as much as possible. So we can push in on that spring guide and unscrew our cocking piece. Keep a hold of everything that's under tension, pull this guy out, pull that out, so your guide and spring, your cocking piece, and then your firing pin itself will all come out the rear. Now at this point, I recommend not causing a disaster and going ahead and threading the cocking piece back on. Now if we release the magazine, it's going to go right back forward and thankfully be supported. And we can go ahead and do the next part of disassembly, which is to slightly move the barrel rearward, press in this button, and then pull down on that guy. The easiest way to do this at home is, of course, to push the muzzle to the table, but I don't want to tear up our nice leather cover, and I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. So with that button pressed, we can push the trigger guard on down. This guy will be allowed to come forward, except for the part where, hey, we're holding him there. That means I can more easily just go ahead and remove this assembly. Now, again, you want to keep tension backwards, give yourself a little gap. We'll get that cocking piece off once more, and then as we release this, the whole thing's going to come out and forward. Another little tip to know on these guns is that while it should be mostly retained, there is a spring that powers the locking block that's hidden down in here. They don't usually want to fall out, but they can, so make sure it stays where it's supposed to be. If we lower our locking block, we can actually go ahead and remove it and get a look. This upper tooth section, which is notched, by the way, to allow that striker lug to come through, actually fits up into a notch in our bolt body. Now, if I pull that bolt body out, you'll see it's surrounded by two symmetrical recoil springs, much simpler than the previous pistol, and the entire bolt body can be cut out of a single piece of round stock. No fancy external milling, just lots of chopping at a round piece of metal in order to get what you want, and then threading it on the end and boring it out. So this, again, very easy to manufacture. With her apart, if we look right here, we can see our magazine safety. If I go ahead and put a mag in, you'll see it tip down. This little extension would block the trigger with the magazine out, popped in. You'll see that better in an animation. But before we leave the table, I want you to take note of how uneven these springs are. They're actually probably some of the best ones I've seen in a Nambu pistol, and they're still not what you'd call straight and not what you call full mashing extension even between the two recoil springs. And even with that in play, they're rather long and narrow, so they're taking up a lot of force anyway. This would prove to be probably the core problem of Japanese military pistols. Now, I know it's hard to see every little bit and bob, let alone how they work in concert just by pulling this apart, but have no fear, for we have a little film to show you that goes through every detail.
Before we load up this pistol, let's take a look at the magazine catch. Fairly standard for the time, this is a sort of drum shape with a scallop cut in the middle. Pushing the catch in aligns the scallop with the magazine well, which would allow a magazine to fall free. When released, it springs into misalignment. The magazine is also shaped to press the catch aside as it enters, before the catch aligns with a notch in the magazine body and snaps back into place. To ready the pistol, grasp the cocking piece, which also serves as a rear cap for the bolt, pull it back fully, then release. But before we do so, take a look at the bolt. It's currently compressing a pair of long coil springs against the inside of the frame. As we release the cocking piece, these drive the bolt forward into battery. Our cutaway could be a bit confusing, so let's clarify. The bolt rides inside a long extension off the rear of the barrel. This in turn rides in the pistol's frame. The barrel extension and bolt are locked together by a tipping hammer-shaped block at the rear of the pistol. This is hinged into a set of rests under the barrel extension. What you might call the hammer's face is presently being driven up into the underside of the bolt, where it locks against a corresponding notch. The locking bolt has its own coil spring, which wants to press that hammer face down out of lock. However, when in battery, the geometry of the interior frame does not allow this rotation. Notably, this extension off the front of the locking block is shaped to collide with the inside rear of the magazine well. This counteracts the locking spring and keeps that rear in the upwards position. When the pistol is fired, recoil drives both the barrel with this extension and the bolt rearward. After a short length of travel, the locking block is free to spring downwards. At nearly the same moment, the barrel extension collides with the rear of the frame, halting its travel. The now unlocked bolt, however, carries on. As it springs back into place, the bolt face strikes the chamber area of the barrel. This drives it and its extension forward as well. In doing so, the locking block is dragged along, striking the frame and tipping back up into lock. Inside the bolt is the firing pin, which is driven by its own coil spring. Presently, it's unable to dash forward towards the primer, thanks to this long transfer bar sitting in its way. The bar is constantly biased upwards at the rear by this small coil spring over the transfer bar's front extension. Tipping the transfer bar releases the firing pin and discharges the pistol. During recoil, a set of sloped surfaces on the pin and transfer bar meet, shoving the transfer bar out of the path of the firing pin. On the return stroke, however, the faces meet at 90 degrees, and the firing pin is halted in the cocked position. At the front of the transfer bar, we see it interacts with a sort of combination sear and disconnector. This unusually shaped part is hinged to the trigger, and both are powered by a coil spring set between them. Now remember, there are no unnecessary shapes inside one of these old guns, so those 3 tines on the sear mean 3 operations. The rear tine projects to the left, and makes contact with the underside of the transfer bar when we pull the trigger. This tips the bar and fires the pistol. The top tine rests in a notch under the barrel's chamber area, at least when the pistol is at rest. Once fired, the recoiling barrel tips the sear out of its engagement with the transfer bar. This allows the bar to spring back into position, making this a trigger disconnector, meaning we now have to release the trigger in order to re-engage the bar. The front tine merely presses against the inside of the trigger assembly. This keeps the pressure on the trigger spring at the other end of the sear, thereby keeping the trigger biased back forward whenever it's released. Looking at the other side of the trigger, we can see it shaped to interact with an automatic magazine disconnect safety. This piece is currently being tipped by the magazine body, compressing its own coil spring. If we remove the magazine, the safety tips. This aligns its lower projection with the trigger, preventing it from being pulled. Reinsert the magazine, and it tips back away. On the left side of the pistol, we have a rotating manual safety. Flip it over to turn a half-moon notch on its shaft, which now blocks the transfer bar from rising. This means the pistol cannot be fired unless we rotate the safety back around. The extractor is a simple overhead claw. This provides a controlled feed, in addition to yanking our spent casing from the chamber. The case is then driven into the fixed ejector below, and thereby flipped vertically from the pistol. And just to round things out, this is our follower, which rides in the magazine body. It's powered by a coiled wire spring, which keeps it pressed upwards in order to feed each additional round. So long as ammunition remains, cartridges will be stripped from the magazine by the bolt. Once the magazine is empty, the follower rises into the path of the bolt, locking it in the open position and signaling a need to reload.
I hope that clarified things. And now that we know how it works, why don't we get a look at it actually being fired by our own TA May? Thank you, May. We'll get your impressions at the end of the lesson. In the meantime, while the Type 14 was developed at the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal, it did not begin production there. That's because the Kanto quake had accelerated plans to spread out Japanese martial production. By the time our pistol was ready, the Tokyo Arsenal's factories were in the process of being relocated. This was not an all-in-one push, so various facilities moved over several years. So, the Nagoya Arsenal's Chigusa factory was the first to production. The first pistols appear dated for November of 1926. Tokyo Arsenal managed to join in May of 1928. At least I think so. My Japanese sources seem to suggest the arsenal had already moved, but I'm iffy on that. My English language books are more keen on tracking every little microscopic change, and data suggests that they started at Tokyo and then later moved over to Kokura. This assertion seems to fit with available observations, so we'll go with it for now. Regardless of location, it was treated as one continuous series under the same factory symbol. And on that front, these are the arsenal marks we've discussed so far. These rings represent stacked cannonballs. They initially represented the Tokyo Arsenal, but would later transfer with production to Kokura. This other symbol represents Nagoya. It's an abstraction of a pair of shachihoko, carps with dragon heads. If you're wondering how this makes sense, it's because the mouths meet at the bottom and the tails touch at the top. Now there will, of course, be other producers, but for now we need to take a little detour, because by 1932 the Yoshida Nambu wasn't doing so well. In 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army had kicked off the Manchurian Incident, a false flag pretext for the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the decisive action of which lasted until February of 1932. In a report detailing experiences with small arms during this invasion, several complaints were made against the Type 14. Some would be taken up quickly, but others would drag on for a frankly surprising number of years. Even before the invasion was over or the official report finalized, a new standard revision was put in place in January of 1932. The locking block was strengthened. The disconnect was enlarged. The transfer bar was adjusted to provide more leverage. The extractor was improved. The magazine adjusted for better function. Nearly every spring in the gun was beefed up and extended in length. A whole series of changes to the striker was begun, attempting to strengthen it and improve striking force. Now, some of that spring improvement was an attempt to fix inertial drop on the magazines when firing in certain conditions. Ultimately, this didn't satisfy, so we'll see more changes later. increasing the leverage on that transfer bar was likely to offset that stronger spring force. But because those springs still slacked, these Type 14s ended up with insanely light trigger pulls for a military pistol. Not listed in Japanese documents of the time is any mention of the addition of an automatic magazine safety. As I said earlier, this was not an initial feature of the Type 14. Survey data suggests that it appeared around 1932, though no documentation has apparently been found. It seems to have been fit to pistols that were returned for repairs, as were all of these other upgrades, with the cost billed to the unit who sent them back in. Now, let's talk about that firing pin, because it was frankly too brittle and not reliable enough, especially in the cold. It was prone to light strikes and just plain snapping. The original pin was 87 millimeters long and proved both fragile and to have too little room to build up steam for a good punch on the primer. So it was reduced to 73 millimeters in length, which required a corresponding cut in the bolt and even a notch in the locking block. Even so, pin breakage was apparently common enough to warrant providing a spare in many of the standard holsters issued out with these pistols. In November of 1932, Nagoya's Chigusa factory gave up production of the Type 14. By this point, they had not quite managed to produce 8,000 pistols, so it wasn't much to begin with. It's suspected that their machinery was likely purchased by the next manufacturer to enter into the pistol market. Back in 1924, Kijiro Nambu had retired from active military service. Going into private enterprise, he founded the Nambu Rifle Manufacturing Company, which then, of course, bid to contract with the government for production of various arms. This was expanded to the Type 14 pistol in very late 1933. By April 1935, by the way, that transfer of pistol manufacture between Tokyo and C&Rsenal's Fukuoka factory was finished. And while we're confusing things, in 1936, Nambu's firm was merged with two others to form Chokogyo Company Limited. Nambu produced Type 14 sport a logo that is a lightly stylized version of the Nan in Nambu, which also happens to mean south. These pistols, by the way, picked up from the serial number that Nagoya left off from. Regardless of the facilities, production never seems to have kept up with demand for the little automatic. Well, actually, maybe the big automatic. In 1933, it was noted that an entire Army division was short on Type 14s. While efforts were made to increase production, a whole other semi-automatic pistol was adopted in 1934. This was the Type 94, designed by Kijiro Nambu and produced at Chokogyo. It's meant to be a more compact, more reliable, and easier to produce pistol than the Type 14. It did not, however, replace the 14 in service, and we'll cover it more in another lesson. In 1936, we see a minor change creep into the 8mm Nambu pistol cartridge. Muzzle velocity was apparently bumped up to 334 meters per second on average. That's 1,096 FPS. Basically a 10% gain, and probably accomplished through a change in powder. I'm frankly unsure if the sights were adjusted. That same year, 1936, I remind you, production of the Type 14 by the C&Rsenal was halted. Leftover parts and likely some tooling were transferred to the now lone provider, Chokogyo. This would be confusing since there was still a great demand, but government production had been tapering off, likely due to focusing on more important armaments. In May of 1938, approval was given for a more radical solution to the problem of magazines dropping under inertia. A large flat spring was added to the forward grip near the toe. This pressed through a hole in the frame into a notched hole in the magazine. Now it would no longer fall unless deliberately pulled out. It seems this took a while to implement and starts to appear in later 1939. Shortly after, another request from the 1932 report was finally resolved. The trigger guard was considerably enlarged. This had been a problem while fighting in cold conditions on the mainland. Though curiously, it's not because a glove couldn't fit inside the trigger guard. Rather, it was that a thick glove kept enough pressure on the already too light trigger such that after firing your first shot, boom, there wasn't enough room to fully release and therefore fully reset the trigger off the disconnector. Now, even with two automatics in production, demand was never truly met. During 1941, ahead of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Army noted it was short of some 20 to 30,000 pistols. It's no surprise that this same year saw production return to Nagoya, though now at a different factory. Just like the rifles we've covered before, the Toriimatsu plant started cranking out Type 14s. For anyone curious, Toriimatsu, the town, is no more today, as it was consumed by Kasugai. Production seems to have gone serial in November of 1941. Nagaya's Toriimatsu plant seems to have attempted to sort of reintroduce the Type 14, at least in terms of mechanical production. Parts production was better standardized. Previously, much more hand fitting was used in assembly. This is no real surprise, as Kenzo Iwashita, refiner of the Type 99 rifle, was directing the plant now. In addition, some of their first pistols now turn up with a 00 cancellation mark over top of the serial number. These generally mean the arm is second class, demoted to training purposes. Curiously rare for a pistol, this mark appears on a sequential series of early Toriimatsus. On disassembly, the reason became apparent to collectors. These pistols feature a unique upgraded firing pin and corresponding parts. The striker's lug is now centered, which meant modifying the locking lug and the bolt to match the same. The spring guide was fluted to avoid drag inside of the pin. This trial run was apparently unsatisfactory, or perhaps not good enough to justify two very distinct and not convertible systems in play at the same time. Instead, a third pattern of firing pin emerges around mid-1942, shorter still, and an even longer guide rod, but still featuring an offset lug. With Japan now at war on two fronts, and with much better equipped powers, the need for pistols soared much higher. Nagaya's Toriimatsu plant kicked into high gear. Along the way, little changes started to appear to save time. I happen to have a somewhat later Nagaya pistol right here, so let's go ahead and take a closer look. All right, we have a late Type 14, and of course our early. Really only two things stand out: the extended trigger guard and that spring sticking out of the wind. If you're eagle-eyed, the cocking pieces are different, but otherwise it's just a matter of finishing. There's more grind marks on this guy, although this isn't the worst of the batch. The extended trigger guard models tend to average about 32.8 millimeters of open room versus just 21.1 from the previous version. This was not done, like many people think, in order to be able to get your finger in there. The finger, even with a glove, could be shoved in right from the start. They had already tested for that. The problem was releasing the trigger. Now, to make this point, I removed the firing pin from this gun because we don't want to do it unnecessarily, but if you were to fire the gun, boom, click, which it can't do because there's no firing pin, then the action cycles, and this gets a little weird because I have to cycle it manually because it didn't actually go boom, and the magazine has to be in to pull the trigger, so I have to drop the magazine to get it to go forward. Okay, I pulled the trigger, the gun went bang, and the bolt cycled, and pretend all that other stuff didn't happen. When I go to release this trigger, at some point, the disconnect is going to do its job. It's going to reset, because right now it currently is disconnected so that we don't have, in this case, striker follow, or even the risk of full auto, although it's more likely to just get follow and no bang at all. This needs to go click when we release. Now let's see how long it takes to go click. There it was. Did you hear that? Now with the old system, you might not be able to fully release your finger enough, because even if your finger slammed into the wall in that tight trigger guard, your glove had enough tension to not allow this to flick forward. And there's really, you can kind of tell there's not that much spring pressure back on the trigger. So if it was just barely held back, I'm barely touching it, it might be enough to not get into full disconnect and therefore not reset for the next shot. That's why you had to go ahead and open her up so that you can fully release the trigger and then pull it again. While we're looking at the trigger guard area, I want to point out something that is just a minor change and yet does appear in the later pistols. The pivot pin for the trigger is sort of proud on these early ones. On the later ones, they fit it and then ground it off flush. The pin's still there, you're just not going to drive it out very easily without it looking real ugly. Now, if you look at the earlier pistol and the later one, you can see it's a looser grain pattern, lighter wood, and if you were to take these off and hold them, I'll assure you this is lighter, flimsier wood. This was them getting by with what they had during the war. These also appear to just have some sort of linseed oil coating. They don't have the urushi lacquer. The cocking piece is radically simplified. It's now perfectly round, no flats at the top. no wings cut into it for you to be able to get in there and grip. And then the checkering is actually made much more coarse. Originally, they kept the same checkering just on a round piece, but this soon proved to be probably a bit too hard to get your fingers on, so a coarser texturing meant that it was more easily retracted. The rear sight has also been simplified. In this case, we just have a plain notch instead of our undercutting. That means the undercutting was done for a very specific reason that had to do with reading sights, and I would really love to read any literature on why they did that. This is frankly better, although they didn't go so far as to make the front sight match. It's still just a barleycorn, so it's not perfect, but actually kind of better. Now, our magazine no longer falls free. When I hit the button, you can see there's a little tension, and that's probably just because of the age of this pistol that one spring is finally losing to the other. But in theory, it shouldn't go anywhere because of this big flat spring. This guy's been pinned into the front of the frame, and there's been a cut made so that it can extrude into the mag well. Matching cut is made in the magazine body so that when they align, they click together happily. This makes extracting the magazine with the bolt locked open even worse, mind you. The magazine is now blued, and the base is made out of a lighter alloy, which was introduced all the way back in 1933 as far as I understand it. The reason for this is probably because the magazine itself, its weight, was adding to the problem, and the spring that holds onto this notch right here prevented this from having more weight, and therefore presumably kept it from dropping mags. Now, I've never seen anybody duplicate the mag drop issue in the modern era, but it is recorded in the Japanese records, so it apparently was a big enough problem for them to address. Everybody loves markings, so let's just review real quick. We've got Nagoya supervision of the, well, it's actually going to be the Torimatsu plant because there's no subcontractor. That mark right there is actually Ro from Iroha, so that's going to be the third pass of the climb on these numbers. And then we have, of course, our Showa mark, and then 19 plus 1925, 1944, and the 5th month, May. This is actually right in the sort of thick of heavy production. And you can kind of tell, while the bluing is nice, it's evenly applied and dark across the whole thing, and you can see machine marks in the frame. Although not as terrible as you might think, this could get a lot worse, and did before being recovered into a more acceptable level of quality until the end of the war when it fell off the cliff. Now, unfortunately, this pistol just wasn't in good enough shape to handle a live fire demonstration, but thankfully the differences are fairly minor. We're in the humid south, so no gloves, no freezing the firing pin, and apparently no magazine drop, which means these changes have no effect on us anyway, so we'll just carry on with the lesson. Throughout most of the war, the Chokogyo firm and the Nagoya arsenal kept up production, though the former slowly bled down, producing fewer and fewer Type 14s. Recall, they were now making two distinctly different pistols, and one of them was cheaper and faster to produce. Material shortages and later on US bombing runs were taking a toll. Ultimately, Chokyogo's assembly of the Type 14 pistol was halted in August of 1944, with tooling and unfinished parts being transferred over to Nagoya, the sole remaining producer. From here on out, quality fell more and more until January of 1945, when it shot back up, likely due to actual failings and an overhaul of the process. Still not pre-war quality, mind you, and eventually seeing very little finish again, along with things like smooth grip panels to really speed it up. However, things remained functional until right at the very end, when the last-ditch pistols were assembled from stray parts and previously disqualified frames. These can be downright crude. Now, if you're into serial numbers, production can be just a touch confusing. Just like the rifles, these Type 14 pistols needed a way to loop their serial blocks. For the most part, however, it wasn't really necessary. Remember, Tokyo moved their production over to Kokura without changing symbols. The serial block remained the same. The combined total for both is estimated at just 35,500 pistols, not enough to clear 5 digits of production. Nagoya's Chigusa factory ran from 1926 to 1932 and only managed an estimated 7,825 pistols. This line was turned over to Nambu Rifle Manufacturing, later known as Chokogyo, which carried on the same serial block. they did manage to crank out an estimated 112,475 total units. During 1941, they rolled over, meaning a prefix character was added. E, the first of the Japanese phonetic alphabet, which had been ordered on a pangram poem known as Iroha. Around the same time, Nagoya Torimatsu plant had begun work. It seems they were given the same series prefix, but started at the 50,000 mark halfway up the ladder. In 1943, the second letter of the alphabet was used after hitting 6 figures of production again. Now we see Ro from Iroha. Despite its late entry, Nagoya managed the most units produced at an estimated 126,500. All this makes for an estimated total of just 282,300 pistols. That's relatively low, all things considered. Ultimately, the Type 14 fell short of what was really required for a Second World War era pistol. While it does have its defenders, even they struggle to explain some core functional problems. The ammunition is just too weak, but then again, so are the coil springs, which slack and bind frequently. Sure, some examples just work, but most are prone to various jams, and that's despite being such a large and heavy pistol. Even if it worked great, the grip was too thin, designed for manufacture more than the human hand. The safety required a second hand in order to operate. The magazine latch was too simple, requiring more parts to fix its problems along the way. The bolt hold open is just the follower, which causes issues trying to snag a mag out and recharging the bolt when reloading. The pistol is frankly too delicate for its own job. While it's an interesting handgun, it seems to have had too little testing, floating along with bureaucratic momentum and ultimately creating the need for a number of changes later on. Each improvement, however, feels ad hoc and insufficient, chasing a number of symptoms instead of a cure. Now, as for our inventor, Tomonori Yoshida, well, things didn't work out as well as one might hope for him either. On the surface, it looked great for a while. He worked at improving the loading mechanism of the Type 11 machine gun, developed the Type 1 heavy machine gun, and was involved in semi-automatic rifles. In 1935, he became chief of firearms manufacture at the Kokura Arsenal. In 1940, he rose to commanding officer of the same. And in 1943, he was attached, on paper mind you, to the Army Ordnance Admin Headquarters. That last bit was likely the signal for the end of his life. You see, Yoshida was caught as part of a scandal that rocked the Kokura Arsenal. Suppliers to the factories had been submitting inflated material delivery reports, receiving payments for goods that they never delivered. Between 1941 and 1943, this apparently totaled some 1.6 billion yen in embezzlement. Now, it's a bit difficult to convert currency at a specific date and during wartime, but the few calculators I found put this at roughly $370 million. In 1942 dollars, I believe. Several well-known companies and many retired high-ranking officers were involved in this caper. Once it was uncovered, the government panicked. During wartime, with all the privations, there might actually be a revolt. So, instead of a public court-martial, the man in charge of the arsenal was summoned by the Prime Minister himself. Hideki Tojo was, of course, also the army minister. He placed the blame for the scandal on Yoshida. Following this meeting, Yoshida returned to Kokura and promptly shot himself in the director's office. His military records note that he retired October 30th of 1943. His death was recorded by the attending military doctor as an unexpected heart attack, and a grand funeral was held for him at the arsenal. All of this likely explains why we've known so little about the development of the Type 14 thus far. It seems its creator was shrouded in secrecy, both for the state's and his own honor. Now, with all of this covered, let's go ahead and get our TA May in here and have her discuss her experience with the Type 14 and maybe some speculation on the Type 14. All right, we made room for May.
Hello.
And we have a smattering of Nambu pistols.
That we do.
You've handled what we previously called the 1902 modified, which weirdly is okay by naming conventions, but technically is the large model Type B. I'll sort this out later. That's a whole other lesson.
It has been quite some time.
This is going to get redone. But you did handle this pistol. Mm-hmm. Our example then was not in the best shape because you had to release the grip safety every time between shots.
Yeah, it was unfortunate. I mean, I got a feel for it, but not the best feel, I would say.
This is a different one, and we'll make use of it along with hopefully some others that may be coming to us.
Sure.
I know of at least one example. If anybody has a peep-on Nambu and wants to loan it for something like that in the future, that'd be great. This will not be
the
right
large,
away.
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The original. So we do have a friend that's supposed to be getting a baby in his hands, but we'll see how that goes. Long story short, this will get another lesson, but it's going to be a good bit. Now, compared to this, what are your initial impressions picking up a Type 14? Like, how does it differ if you're used to the old Nambu?
Well, I will say the grip certainly does feel different. That one is, I guess, just longer, not width-wise, but just
Front to back?
Front to back, yep, while this one is certainly narrower.
It feels a little bit thicker and a lot shorter to me.
Sure.
Okay. And then anything else?
Well, it's obviously longer in general for lengthwise, so I guess meant for much longer hands or much larger hands?
I'm not sure who has a hand that large in the Japanese army.
Seems a little bit unusual for it to stick out that far, unless they were simply just trying to add an extra round in there, going from 7 to 8 and increasing it and stretching it as a result of that.
I don't know. But this is perfectly fitted my big hand.
Sure.
And then you must have incredible overextension on that. I mean, that's just sticking out in the wind.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Okay. Let's see. Initial grip. Anything about weight or balance? Is there any big difference?
I mean, arguably very Nambu sensationally, I could say. Nothing really all that unusual about it in terms of transitioning from this one, from the previous to this one. I will say, however, that one certainly feels and looks more polished, where it seems like there's a lot of contouring that goes and flows with it, whereas this one does kind of feel blockier in some ways, so like it doesn't really feel like it meshes as well with itself. Like I'm going from rectangles to swoops, and
we played the Elven
it's very strange.
We played Elven / Dwarvish before. The old one, Elf. That one, Dwarf.
I could see that.
Very, like, it's all either perfect circles or otherwise straight lines, and this is much more contouring.
But still ray gun-ish looking, high bore axis. If you had shown me these two from a distance, I would say they were still both definitely Nambus.
Both are kind of like the Luger, where there's just no weight in the front. It's just all in the back of your hand.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. We're going to load this thing up, and I'm going to ask you to do something a little special on this one.
Okay.
Run the magazine dry for a second. Let's talk about that magazine. So, mag release good.
Very positive. Definitely pops it out the bottom. Can't argue with that.
And then cocking handle, easy?
Yeah, not too bad. And it seems it holds open. Although, does it hold open separately from the follower, or is it catching? It looks like it's catching on the follower.
Loading up wasn't too bad for us when we demoed it because we're going from an empty gun.
Ah, so it is holding on the follower only.
Right. So that means if you want to reload, we're going to have to we're going to have to yank it out. We're going to have to shove it in and then recock. So not like a 1911. There's a hold open, but it's not the one you want.
And I will say, I do kind of miss the tapered wings that we had on the previous model. Those were really nice to pinch and gave me a positive grip. These are not quite as nice.
Yeah, you kind of have to rely on the meat of your fingers getting into the grooves and engaging with the checkering that's on the high spots.
Yeah, I'm just saying that one works with the soldier. This one, not quite as much.
Okay. Let's see. What else? We've got...
We changed safeties.
Oh, that's true. Oh, good Lord. Okay, so the automatic safety's gone, which we did have problems with.
Correct, we did have problems. Now, if it had functioned fine, and we hadn't really noticed anything, I would say grip safety, not too bad. I don't have to worry about flipping it on and off. It's right there.
Does it disturb your grip at all?
Not really, actually. And if anything, they tried to contour it. You can see where they put little finger grooves right there for your middle finger and ring finger. So really not too terrible of a concept if it worked, all the time.
Yeah, it's like Gen 2 Glock, right?
This one, okay, it's a flip safety. Great. Let me just reach it with my single hand, which it's only supposed to be operated one-handed. No, that's a second hand having to come in to operate that. Can you reach it?
No, even with the size of my hand, there's no hope in heck of being able to. Now, I know some people are thinking, well, hold on, that's the fire position, so you're on safe here, but
it is
really hard to get power up on that.
Yeah, that's not great.
And then also, you can tell it was really just sort of added to the design later because it scratches up the frame every time you use it, and if you can go the other way, and it tears up the grip when you do that, and inevitably there is damage in that direction. I couldn't tell you for sure if that was done by U.S. capture or if it was done by the guys who own them going, hold on, and just not reading the manual the first time around.
True.
But yes, it is really, really a poorly done manual safety. Requires a second hand to operate, and at this time, they were not training on two-handed shooting.
Nope.
So and it's not even like with two hands you could just flip it. It's still a bad position for two-handed shooting.
Not fantastic, unfortunately.
All right, so we've got it on fire. We've got it loaded up. Your sights you're not too happy with either?
No, unfortunately. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not a fan of the fact that they have a tangent rear sight on the previous model. That was strange. But, you know, it was a barleycorn front with a, what is it, just a V-notch rear?
Yes, very soft and very shallow V-notch, so not great.
Not great. But then what we come over here and we have a barleycorn with an inverted triangle that it fits into that is not a perfect fit where you fit one perfectly into the other. They are certainly different angles.
Right.
It's not great.
There is a modern pistol that does this for comparison. It's the Draconi, as the creator wanted to call it, but as most people know, it's the Steyr M9 series of pistols. They have a triangular front sight and a triangular notch in the rear. However, those lines match up. They're the same angle. This is two different angles, so you end up with this floated front sight, and all you're doing is like 3-point aligning these two spikes this way and one spike that way.
Not fantastic.
No.
Not a quick read, and honestly, for fine shooting, it's got to be terrible too. So I'm not sure what exactly they were thinking about with that one.
All right, so we pull the trigger.
You know, this is the part that was actually surprising to me because I guess I just didn't expect it on the Nambu.
Yeah, no one expects the Nambu trigger.
Yeah, no one does. So I get through just a tiny bit of take up, and then I have this rubbery sensation, and I think, I've hit the wall right here.
It's coming. Like you're feeling that
right
spring
there.
stack, so you're like, here, I'm going to feel a little bit of a wall.
Like a little bit of a push, like something I'm going to hit against, and then no, in that little bit of rubbery sensation, it just goes off.
Right.
It's so light, and there's so little there. What is happening? That's very unusual.
As a normal shooter, like as somebody that shot other handguns, it is insane to be like, all right, so if you're trying to think about it, you know, and you go, there's the untensioned take-up, so just flopping around, like on a Mosin trigger, they have tons of that. Then you hit the feeling of spring stack, and you're like, I'm going to start building up against this. Boom! Just gone.
Basically just said what I just said.
I mean, gnat's fart.
I know, it's amazing.
It is the most terrifying semi-automatic pistol trigger outside of a target pistol that I've ever...
Were they trying to make it that light? Because I feel like that's not the best for soldiers.
So the springs are bad,
Okay.
so it's a little hard to judge.
Okay.
And it's especially why you feel that rubbery sensation, because if you got rid of the rubbery sensation, the Nambu Type 14 has a hell of a target trigger, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure. We do know in the documents we have available, when they changed the springs in the gun overall to thicken them up and make them stiffer, they actually moved the fulcrum point of the transfer bar in order to get more leverage. So that means they went, ooh, the trigger got heavier, we should keep it light. So I guess they were going for it. It is unsafe light for a military pistol. It is, and I'm thinking, like, okay, so the Navy bought some of these guys, right? But the Army has no experience with automatic handguns other than some C96s that fell into the Kwantong Army and stuff like that because they hated the 26 so bad. Can you imagine trying to train people on semi-automatics and giving them this trigger?
I don't imagine that it went so well from the very offset, I would say.
No, I mean, there's probably a reason why a magazine disconnect got added later, too.
Probably.
Anyway.
I personally enjoyed it, but not what I expected by
the
any
way,
means.
everybody's like, I also love this, magazine safeties. Everybody complains about them because it ruins the trigger. Not on the Nambu. The magazine safety does not seem to have any effect to the negative on the Nambu. To be fair, it's just a pass go.
Yeah.
Once it moves out of the way, there's no stack. So, all right, so it went bang almost unexpectedly.
Yep, and then recoil. You know, it actually looks a lot worse than what it is because it definitely was snappier thanks to that high bore axis, but it didn't feel all too bad.
No, it's a heavy pistol.
No.
But for a cartridge that's pushing close to 380 spec out of a 2-pound handgun, You feel like your follow-up time was what it should be?
I mean, probably not. I do wish it had been more controllable, or at least it hadn't quite snapped quite as well as it did. But unfortunately, it is what it is.
It's surprising because you would expect with everything else going on, the good rake on the pistol, this linear action, not a lot of inertia moving to the side because of the toggle or because of the locking bolt, and a light cartridge. You'd expect to be able to just be like, boom, 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 boom. But no, there's still a bit of just...
And then you have to bring it back down to those sights every time.
Oh, yeah,
that
reacquiring.
Beautiful. Great. Thanks. Thank you for that, Nambu.
These are, I mean, really, it is a tiny little front sight floated in that
It's not great.
bucket. All right, this is not the final version of the Type 14.
Oh, that's good.
Let's borrow this later war one.
All right.
Now, what stands out to you?
Well, two things stand out very obviously when I put it in my hand. The grip certainly feels different with this little spring down here. Some sort of magazine spring, I'm guessing.
Yeah. No.
Definitely is, yes. Considering the last one just falls out, this one definitely seems to
So from the
not be
previous
letting
model?
gravity assist it as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess maybe they're having an issue with that or worried about it. And then obviously our trigger guard here is allowing for larger fingered men and or gloved fingered men, I'm assuming.
The problem was with the release, not with the actually getting your finger in there.
Meanwhile, they're like, oh, great, keep the safety as it perfect. Let's
Yeah,
keep
no
it
problem
weird
there.
and to the side like that. Awesome. Our cocking knob is definitely different. We've gone from this cleaned out serrations to where now it's just a full one. Although I will say, I like the checkering on this one. It's very pronounced knurling.
So initially they just ditched these fins, let's call them.
Okay.
And then it stayed fine checkered, and of course that became a little difficult to work.
Oh,
so
I
they
can
went to
see
a
that.
coarser checkering. How's the coarser checkering work for you?
Well, I just said it's better.
No, but
Like-
you haven't even...
Oh, I mean, I
Yeah,
can.
you gotta prove it. Prove it to the audience.
No, yeah, it's definitely solid. I get a good purchase with it, like
Okay.
I thought I did. And then the sights are improved, definitely. Would pick these sights all day long, even though they're not the best. So what we're looking at now is we have a square notch rear with the barleycorn front. It's not the finest read, but you know what? I'll take it over this weird
the
inverted
undercut.
triangle.
Square would have been great, guys.
Would have
But-
been perfect, but you know what? This is at least better than what we had previously.
Now, we didn't shoot this example, but it's the same light trigger, I assure you.
Okay.
Same general recoil. It's really down to how May felt about those sights. Do you think that really would have changed the whole pistol for you, having slightly better sights?
I mean, at least I would have had a better, faster read on it. I do really like that. And also now I have the option to wear gloves if I want. That's a good plus.
Overall opinion on the Nambu, would you want to go into a war zone with this?
Probably not. I would not inspire confidence. I don't think the cartridge is quite as strong as I would like it. And also that high bore axis, not great. Combined with those wonderful sights, especially if I have this inverted triangle with the barleycorn front, I'm not super enthused by it.
Now, you're saying all that, but don't forget, it's also much less reliable than most semi-automatic pistols from its era.
Oh, that's great.
So does that help you across the line?
Yeah, no, totally.
Can I ask you one thing, though? Why do you hesitate to condemn it? Because we both do. Uh-huh. Like, can you put words to it? Can you put words to why you don't hate it?
I mean, I can't put words to why I don't hate it, no, I guess.
I think it's twofold. One, it's very interesting looking.
I mean, it certainly is. It feels very spacey.
I'm endeared to it. Just on sight, I love this thing.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on here? And then two, Kijudo Nambu was behind this version of it. Obviously, we've corrected the record on who else was involved in this. But if the Nambu Type 38 rifle is sublime, it is almost perfection in a bolt-action military rifle, right? Then you have, well, not even that. It was actually this version, you know? And you start going, why? There's so many inefficiencies in this. Even the lock, it seems simple, sure, but a Bergman lock's technically simpler and more robust. So it boggles the mind as to why you're attracted to it and you want it to work and you're rooting for the underdog. But it doesn't. It actually is, as far as I can tell, an inferior pistol across the board.
I mean, I can't say I'm specifically rooting for it, but I certainly like the aesthetic change up they have here for looks and appearance in general.
Yeah.
But I can't say I'm rooting for that necessarily.
It looks awesome. but unfortunately it does not deliver.
Yeah.
Now, I have an extra credit question for all of you, so please turn those in. It's going to be, did the Type 14 actually meet its design goals? Not competition with the rest of the world, because that's not what the design goal was. The design goal was to have a simplified, producible pistol for mass manufacture for the Army that would be superior to the Type 26 revolver. And then, if you think that it didn't meet its goals, how would you have done it? And remember, you must keep in mind the abilities of the Japanese Empire at the time. The chief one we've noticed is the inability to make those coil springs. So let us know how you feel on that front.
Absolutely.
All right, with that assignment in your hands, I believe it's time for y'all to get out of here.
Bye.
Have a good one. All right, everyone, special thanks for this episode goes out to my buddy Wolf for again helping me through these notes and making some decisions about how we want to translate some things. His friend Austin Adachi also provided a lot of material. He's over at rikosentai.net. And then I need to make sure that I thank my buddies Brian and Tombus for going ahead and supplying me some pistols that we were able to use for demonstrating all of this for you today. As always, you can support the show over at Patreon or Subscribestar, and we really appreciate that because it's the only way it gets done. All right, y'all have a good one.